And here we are back in part two of this two-part sequence on converting PSD files, wireframe files in Photoshop, into fully functioning HTML and CSS markup. Now, it turns out the basic techniques we're using here also apply to converting full-fledged designs in Photoshop into HTML and CSS, particularly in terms of how we're positioning and sizing the regions on our pages. So, even though right now we're just pulling in wireframes, the basic techniques are also going to suit us well when it comes time to move in a fully designed element from Photoshop into our website. So let's pick up right where we left off. We've already created a header region, as we can see here inside of Firefox. And if we skip back over to our Photoshop file, we see the next region we want to build is our navigation. So again, we're going to collect some basic information about it. Well, we know it's going to be 12 columns wide. It spans the full width. We don't know yet how tall it should be, so let's get that information. We'll come in here and open up the info box. Okay, 94 pixels tall. That looks good. It's the second darkest region, so it's going to be a different weight value on this one. And to see what that is, let me come back to my eyedropper tool, pick that gray color up, and okay, it's 727070. Okay, and we have the text as well. It's navigation, so we'll make a quick note of that. Okay, and then we'll hop back into Firefox and take another quick look here. Okay, everything's good. Let's come over to Vim, and we'll go into our HTML file. And actually, as it turns out here, we've added our opening header tag, but we need to add that closing header tag to make this valid HTML markup. Let's add that in. Okay, and now we can add the tag for our next section, our navigation. Sure enough, we can use the nav tag for that. It's a good fit. We'll go in and add our class. We know we want this to be 12 columns wide, so we do grid underscore 12. The height is going to be 94, so we'll add that in. The weight is going to be 2. It's the second most important section. Okay, and then we'll close that out. Within it, we're going to add another p tag to surround our text. We'll call this our navigation. Close out the p tag and close out the nav tag. Now, before we test this, we already know we have two new classes that we haven't yet defined, height 94 and weight 2. So we'll come over to our style sheet, and I'm going to add the first one to the beginning since it's a less tall version of what we already had. So we'll put them in ascending order. 94. And we're going to say the height here is 94 pixels. Weight, we have weight 1, so we're going to add weight 2. And we grabbed the background color for that. We know it's going to be 727070. I'm not sure if I have to update the color of the font, so I'm not going to do that yet. Let's save this. Let me double check my height. I want to make sure I got that right. Tap U here, 94, yep, that's all set. So back in Firefox now, we can refresh. Okay, there's our navigation. Well, we're not picking up that weight, so let's see what we did wrong there. In other words, we don't see the background color. Let's come over here. Weight 2, okay, I forgot the underscore on the name. That would do it. So we'll add that back in, save it, come back to Firefox, refresh. Okay, there it is. I do think that a white color on that text is going to be better here. So let's go ahead and copy this line, and then we'll paste it in. Oops. Copy the line and paste it. Okay. And let's refresh that. All right, now I've already set the padding on my p tag. I'm using the p tag again, and so the padding applies. So I'm in pretty good shape here. One thing you will notice, though, is I have some extra space between my header and my navigation expressed in Photoshop, but we don't see it here inside of my markup. So come back to our code, and we're going to add in a margin row class. And we're going to set the margin top on that to be 10 pixels. And we'll set the margin bottom to be 10 pixels as well. And now back in our HTML file, we're going to add this row class, this margin row class, to each of our elements. And that is going to give us some spacing between them. And if we refresh, there we go, there's that spacing. Okay, back in Photoshop, our next element is the sidebar. And again, we're going to collect that same basic set of information. First, let me grab the background color, because that's a new shade of gray, and it's BBBBB. That's easy enough to remember. The title is sidebar. I can see here, this one spans 4 columns, only 4 columns. And the height, well, we don't know the height yet. Let's go into the sidebar section. We'll tap U. 700 is going to be our height there. Okay, we have all the information we need to set this up, back both in our HTML and our CSS documents. So we'll come in here, we'll add a new section. I'm going to use the aside tag for this one. That's a pretty good fit for a sidebar. And it's going to be grid_4 because we're only spanning 4 columns. The height is going to be height_700. This is a weight 3, our third most important section. And we'll add that margin row class in there to create the spacing between regions, top and bottom. Add a p tag and add the section here. Sidebar is the text. Close that out and close out the aside tag. Okay. We'll save that. We'll come back to our styles. And in our style sheet here, let's go ahead and add in what we're missing at this point. Well, we need to add the weight class. We know that. After a while, we get to reuse everything. But the first time we define any class, we have to be sure that we set it up in our CSS file. And we're going to set our background color here and make it BBB. Now here, it's a light enough shade of gray that I know I can keep my font color as black, and that'll be just fine. I do need to add my height. Let's add that in here. So height is going to be _700, and we'll make that height 700 px. Okay, save that, and let's check out our browser and see what we have. Okay, there is our sidebar. And it's the right height, it's got the right content, we've got some margin here between it and the navigation, and sure enough, the width is also exactly right. It's 4 pixels across. 4 columns across, I should say. Much more than 4 pixels. Okay, back in Photoshop, we'll create our main content section. We're going to create that, then create our footer, and then we'll come back and add the subregions in here within main content. Okay, so we'll come to our main content layer. We can see we're using the same background color as the header, so we know the weight is going to be 1. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 columns here. Makes sense because our columns have to add to 12, so we've got 4 plus 8, that gives us 12. The height is going to be, if we click on our main content layer, 700 again. Well, that's no surprise. It's the same height as our sidebar, and it says main content. So we have all the information that we need. We come back to Vim, come back to our HTML document. Now here, we don't really have a good tag in HTML5 other than section to use. So we'll use section. We'll give it an ID to be a little more specific, and we'll call that our main content, since that's what it is. And we'll give it its classes, beginning with grid 8. The height is going to be 700. The weight is going to be 1. And we'll give it that margin row class. Great thing now is all of our classes have already been defined. The only new one we're using is grid 8, but that's defined once again by the 960 CSS file. So we're in good shape there. So we'll come in here and add our p tag. We'll call it main content. Close out the p tag and close out the section tag. Okay, let's save that up, come back to Firefox, refresh. There's our main content section. We'll come in here and we'll add our footer, our final main section. Back in Photoshop, there's our footer. Well, we know it's going to be weight 2 because it matches the background color on the navigation. We know it's 12 columns. I'm guessing the height is also going to be 94, but let's double check that just to be sure. And if it were something else, we could certainly accommodate that. Let's see here. Looks like actually our height is going to be 100 on this one. Okay, so it is a little different. Okay, good. So 100 on our height, and we're calling it footer. Okay, we have all the information we need back in Vim. We're going to come in and add our footer. Here we can use the footer tag, so we don't have to add another ID to this one. We add our classes. Grid is going to be 12. Height is going to be 100. Weight is going to be 2. And then margin row to give us our margins on the top. Close that out. Add our P tag. We'll call this our footer. Close that. Save this file, and we have one class we have to add, height underscore 100. So let's just go ahead and copy that. Come into our style sheet. There's 94, 200. We're going to insert it right here. Go ahead and paste that in. And got to make sure we add our period to the beginning. Height is 100 px. Save that, and we'll come over to Firefox, refresh the page. Okay, there's our footer. We're in good shape. We just have to add those intersections to the main content. Now, to do that, we're going to start nesting our HTML. We have a section tag for main content, and within the section tag, we're going to add additional tags, additional sections for each of these 3 elements. Now, because these 3 elements are stacked on our page here, we are going to need to add 2 classes to each one of them. One of those classes is alpha, and the other is omega. Those classes are going to ensure that we don't have extra margins on either side that make these elements a bad fit. What I mean by that is every time we use a grid underscore class from the framework, one of the things we're getting in that class is margins on the left and the right. 10 pixel margins, 10 on the left and 10 on the right. Now, generally that's just fine, and we want those margins because they create the gutters in between, for example, sidebar and main content. But when we're putting elements inside of other elements, those margins can get in the way. And so alpha and omega are 2 classes that remove those margins. Alpha removes the left margin, omega removes the right margin. Using them both is going to knock out both the left and the right margins on our files and in our code. Now, taking a closer look at what's set up in this file, actually, let's zoom in here. And it appears this Photoshop file has been set up. So we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. As I zoom in closer here, I'm noticing the Photoshop file actually violates one of the rules I mentioned at the onset. Oh, I take that back. I've added a couple additional guidelines, which has confused me. Let's drop out those guidelines because they're getting a little bit in the way here. So this guideline, we'll just make that go away. And this guideline here, we'll make that go away. Okay, there we go. So now if I zoom back in, we get a better sense of what's happening. Okay, our outer container, main content, spans our 8 columns here. Our inner containers don't quite span 8 columns. And that's going to be tricky to achieve using the 960 grid system, because 960 wants to use full columns for the width. Either it could be 1 column, it could be 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, anything between 1 and 12. But if it's less than a full column, we can't use the 960 framework, and that framework's going to save us a lot of time, so it's good to use it if we can. So we have a couple options. One of them is we can, in Photoshop here, to reflect what we're going to do inside of our HTML file, we can actually extend these out all the way to the edges. In other words, we're going to make them line right up against the full column here that they start on, and the full column that it ends on. So to show you what that would look like, let's go into our main content here, and I believe it's this layer. Yep, it is. Okay, and then we can transform the layer and pull it out here. Whoop, wrong layer. Let's remove our connection here on these two layers. Come out of our free transform mode. Okay, I'm going to unlink the layer so I can edit this one individually. And now I'm going to stretch it out so it hits against those columns exactly. Save that. Okay, now I have something I can reliably create using the grid system. In fact, all I need to do here is add in my 3 tags, one for each of the sections, give them grid_8 classes, add alpha and omega because we want to get rid of the margins on the left and the right so they butt right up against the edges there. And then, as usual, define the height, define the background color. So let's grab the background color while we're in here. All right, and that's also BBBB. So we actually have only 3 different weights we're working with. And how about the height? Let's take a quick look at what that is. I'm actually going to use my rulers to do that here. And let's see. I can grab this real fast. We'll just drop a guideline on here. And another guideline at the bottom. Hold down the shift key so I line up on full pixels. Okay, so now between the two, I can just make a quick selection to grab this height, and it's 71 pixels. Okay, so we've got all the information we need now to create these. All we need to add is that alpha and omega set of classes. So back in Vim, let's come to our HTML. We're going to come inside of our section area here, and we're going to add a subsection. We're going to give it an ID equal to story1. It's just the first in our set of stories. The class is going to equal grid_8, height _100. I'm sorry, height was 71. Weight _3. Let's put the margin row on it so we get top and bottom margins. Let's do alpha to get rid of the left and omega to get rid of the right. So quite a few classes there, but that's going to fully define this region for us. And then, even though I don't have it in my wireframes, let me add a little label here. We'll just call this story1. Okay? Close out the section tag. And before we go any further, let's make sure we have all those classes we need. Height 71, I believe, is going to be a new class. So let's get ready to copy that. Yeah, we need a height 71. So we'll insert a period. We'll paste in the class name. Add in the rest of the code here. Define the property height. It's going to be 71 pixels. Okay. And back in Firefox, let's see what we're working with. We'll go ahead and refresh this. Okay, there it is, story 1. Now, if we wanted to add stories 2 and 3, all we need to do is select the story, come in here and, whoops, let's add a spot for that, and the next one, and then finally paste that in. Okay. Those are 4 stories. What do we have? 3? No, we just had 3, so we'll get rid of that last one there. Drop the line. And I just need to make sure I update my ID names, update the text inside here. Okay. Save that, come back to Firefox and refresh, and I have my 3 stories. Now, here's the great thing about the 960 framework. If I decided I wanted to change up my layout, it's a relatively easy thing to do. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to make these 3 elements side by side rather than stacked one on top of the other. Well, to do that, I need to figure out how many columns each of them is going to be, update my grid_class name, and then I'm going to tinker with my alpha and omega settings just a little bit. So here's how we'll do it. We'll come back to Photoshop, and let's see, how many columns do we have available? Well, we have 8. Now 8 is not going to divide by 3 very nicely, so my columns aren't going to be the same width unless I have some extra space at the end, which we could do. We could say we have a 2 column, a 2 column, and a 2 column, and then we'll have 2 columns left over. Or we could add 4 columns worth of stories. Why don't we do that? We'll add an additional column, and that way our content is going to fit the space a little bit better. Okay, so we know each of these is going to be 2 columns wide. Let's go ahead and keep the height what it is. We won't mess with the background color. All we're going to change is the grid underscore value, and we're going to change that from 8 to 2, and then we're going to add an additional story. So we'll come back to Vim, and let's go ahead and change this. So grid 8 here is going to become grid 2, and grid 2. Then I'm going to take my last one, copy it, add a new line, and paste it in. And I need to update my ID there. We'll make it 4. Story 4 is the text. Okay. Now I mentioned tinkering with alpha and omega. Now that we're lining these up side by side, we can use alpha and omega in a slightly more traditional kind of way. Putting alpha on the first element, omega on the last element, and then we can dump alpha and omega from all the others, because we still want spacing in between here, in between our columns. So let's come back and let's get rid of what we have here. Line by line, we'll just delete them. So let's get rid of that, get rid of that, and we can actually get rid of alpha here too. Whoop, got rid of a little too much. Okay, get rid of alpha, make sure we have a space there, and we can also get rid of alpha on this one. Okay, so our first column has alpha, our last column has omega, and our middle columns, they don't need anything. Save that, come back to Firefox, and see what we're working with. Okay, there we have an inner 4-column layout within our main content section here, our main content region on the site. And of course, if we wanted to, we could modify, well, for example, the height. Let's say we wanted to make that height not what it is now, 71, but 100. We just come in here, add in 100. We've already established that class. We've defined that class in our style sheet, so we don't have to do anything else. Save that, come back to our browser, refresh, and now we have the increased height there on those elements. So there we have a quick tutorial on bringing wireframes from Photoshop into HTML and CSS. Again, we're using the 960 grid system to create our columns, establish the width of each of our elements. 960 is going to give us floating elements so we can get them side by side. Main content is next to sidebar. Story 2 is next to story 1. Otherwise, we're using custom CSS, custom background colors, custom height. We're changing up the text color a little bit and adding padding, all within our styles.css document here, but still a relatively short amount of CSS in order to accomplish this layout. So there it is, a 2-part tutorial on converting PSD to HTML and CSS.